Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm very excited today to announce that we have started a new category on our website. We will now be featuring children's nonfiction books. And today, I will be talking to Annette Pimentel. She's the author of Mountain Chef, How One Man Lost His Groceries, Changed His Plans, and Helped Cook Up the National Park Service. Before I introduce Annette, we want to thank you for all the support you've given on our Facebook page and for following us on Twitter and Instagram. We're excited that now our Android users are listening to us on Stitcher, and we're excited to have the community growing. We hope that you'll give us your ideas for great books for us to feature. Now let me tell you about Annette. She writes true stories about real people. She fits very well into our parameters. She loves finding stories about people that we've never heard of, men, women who've stood at the edges of history and nudged the world one way or another. She uses those stories to collaborate with great artists to create compelling nonfiction picture books, and today's book is no exception. In college, she loved to luxuriate for hours and hours while reading great writing. She earned degrees in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and Brandeis University. After college, she has devoted her time to mothering her 6 children, and they've moved 16 times through 5 countries and 3 continents. Her book, Mountain Chef, has been named by the National Council of Social Studies and the 2017 Carter G. Woodson Award winner for the Best Nonfiction Elementary Title, depicting the experience of an ethnic or racial minority in the United States. We're so excited to talk to Annette today, and we welcome her to the podcast. We're glad you could be with us today, Annette. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
My pleasure.
Well, your book has a very lengthy title, but a fun one, Mountain Chef, How One Man Lost His Groceries, Changed His Plans, and Helped Cook Up the National Park Service. It's really quite fun. You dedicate your book to Granddad, whose Bryce Canyon story sent me looking for this one. Maybe you can briefly tell us that little story and how it piqued your interest.
And actually I learned from my sister that this is not actually a true story, but it was nonetheless what set me out looking, that my grandfather was a great storyteller, and I thought that he had, as a child, met someone who was surveying for the National Park Service. He herded sheep in what is now Bryce Canyon, which he truly did. When he was 7 years old, he was the family sheep herder. And the story, which turns out is apocryphal, was that he had met someone who was there surveying it to become a national park. And he thought that they were crazy, because why would you want a place like Bryce Canyon to be a national park? It's just desert. And so I decided that I know how to do historical research, and I would figure out who he had met. So I started researching people who had gone on National Park Service related trips in the West in 1915, the time when my grandfather was 7 years old. And I quickly stumbled across a trip in California, and there were a lot of photographs from the trip. And there was one photograph in particular that particularly caught my imagination. It was a picture of this elegantly set dining table under giant sequoias. It had a linen tablecloth, there was china, and there were all these men in suits sitting around it. And then behind them, there was a Chinese man in an apron standing looking at the camera. And I was so surprised by his presence. And I thought, what is this person doing in the California woods in 1915? And so I started trying to figure out who he was, and it turned out it was Tai Sing. And it led me to a really fascinating story about someone who led a very interesting life.
You love to do research. And as a nonfiction author, where do you like to start that research?
Um, well, where I started is not necessarily where I find the most information. It starts pretty much wherever I first learn about the person. But what I'm looking for that makes me know that there's a chance that I could make this into a book is when I find some kind of repository of primary source materials. So with the story of Tai Sing, I had seen the photograph of him, and I found an account that had been written by another camper of the camping trip that went through day by day. It was almost like a diary format, although it was written years later. But he had gone through day by day and talked about what happened in the on this particular camping trip. And then, so that was the basis of my researching. But then I discovered that there was a large collection held in the Bancroft Library at University of California, Berkeley, that was a collection of photographs and other ephemera from this trip. And so I went and I spent about a week in the Bancroft Library just going through everything that they had. It was really wonderful. There are very old photo albums that these campers had put together for Stephen Bancroft, who paid for the camping trip, to thank him. It was like a thank you gift. They had assembled these wonderful leather-bound photo albums that included photos and also short things that they had, like captions they had written on the photos. There were magazine articles about the trip. There were a bunch of newspaper articles that were published the week of the trip and about the month afterward, that they'd gotten many of these campers to each write a section for newspaper articles. And so anyway, I had all of these things that I had to put white gloves on so that I wouldn't destroy the items by touching them. And so I spent a lot of time, and that became the real center of my book, was the research that I did there in the archives at Bancroft Library.
Well, that is really interesting. Let's provide some context for our readers and listeners. Can you give us a little history on the National Park Service and how Tai Sing's role played out in the creation of the National Park Service?
Sure, yeah. So there were already national parks in 1915. Theodore Roosevelt had named certain areas national parks, but the problem was that every national park was an entity unto itself. And so there was no consistency across the parks. Some of them were administered by the U.S. Army. Some of them allowed logging and hunting in the national parks. And environmentalists in particular began to be really concerned that the whole concept behind national parks was being lost, that there were not consistent decisions being made nationally. And so they began trying to lobby for a National Park Service organization that would provide a consistent vision across all of the national parks. Stephen Mather went to Washington, D.C. as the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, and his goal was to get Congress to pass a National Service Act. And he spent lots of time lobbying congressmen, and he got really frustrated. And so he decided he was going to leave Washington, D.C. and try something different. And so what he did is he planned this camping trip, and he invited a bunch of opinion makers to go on the camping trip with him. Because he felt like if he could get them away from Washington, D.C., that they would see why we needed to have a National Park Service. If he could get them into the land that the National Park Service should protect. And so he hired Tai Sing and a bunch of wranglers and planned a luxurious camping trip so that they would have a wonderful time and be his allies when they went back to Congress. And in fact, it was very successful. And he did another camping trip in 1916 because it was so successful. And the people who went on the camping trip did become his congressional allies. And also there were businessmen and newspaper editors and magazine writers who all banded together after this camping trip and did a full press on Congress. And in fact, the National Park Service Act did pass the next year in 1916.
Well, I want to have you read from your book about Tai Sing and how you describe his role and give people a flavor of how you write. So if you could read, I'll on page 5 how he got his job. That would be fun for our listeners to hear.
Sure. So the book starts with him as a child, and this is talking about how he began working as a trail cook. He got a job cooking for map makers as they tramped through the mountains, naming peaks. With sky for his ceiling and sequoias for his walls, he stirred silky sauces, broiled succulent steaks, and tossed crisp salads. In his sheet metal oven, he baked sourdough rolls as light as the clouds drifting above the peaks. His reputation grew, the best trail cook in California.
That is some fabulous description. When we hear Tai Sing is famous for being the best trail cook around, we need to know what he cooked. And you list several menu items in the book, which I assume are authentic. Is that true?
That is true. Everything in this book has historical records to back it up.
Why don't you read some of those items on page 8 that he includes in his menus?
All right. Lyonnaise potatoes, peaches and cream, frog's legs, English plum pudding with brandy sauce. He bought bags of flour and tins of sardines and bushels of apples and boxes of crackers and sides of beef. He plated grapefruit and cantaloupe.
Imagine eating that even today on the trail. It's quite amazing that he pulled it off.
At camp, I think, oh, I wish he were with me doing the cooking.
Right. He makes it seem easy, but the book actually has 3 layers of tension, and one is getting us behind the scenes and showing us that it is a little bit difficult for him to provide these meals in the outdoors under rugged conditions. And one of the conflicts is losing a mule that has several of the supplies on it. Another layer, though, of tension is Mather trying to convince Congress to create this National Park Service. Then the third layer would be Tai Sing not being treated as an American citizen. And you set that up really well in the beginning of the book, talking about how America was a tough place to be Chinese. Now, interestingly, this particular character was American-born, and yet it was still tough to be Chinese. Maybe you can read that to us, and it will help explain Ty's situation.
Okay. America was a tough place to be Chinese. Bosses paid Chinese workers less than white workers. Townsfolk spat out Chinese names like they swallowed river gravel. Most people with Chinese names ended up cooking in restaurants or washing clothes in laundries. Tai Sing, though, had American dirt under his fingernails and dreams as big as the country he loved. Cramped shacks weren't for him. He made plans, big plans.
I love the focus of the book being on Tai just working really hard to make these plans so that his meals would be well made and well received. And yet there is this underlying kind of sadness that he's not being, in the larger scheme of things, he's not really accepted as a full-blown American citizen. So I think this political conversation you could have with kids would be centered around discrimination and immigration, which are very hot, current topics, even though this took place 100 years ago. In the back of the book, I want to point this out. You have several really interesting details. You call it, the section is called What You Might Be Wondering. And you have actual photographs from the expedition, and you have things that are true or not. You explain what might be passing through kids' minds as they read this. And one of the things that you talk about is, was Tai a real person? You also give some information about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and that captures some of the reasons that the Chinese might have felt a little less than accepted. Is that one of your reasons for writing this, is getting that information out? Or was it just sort of a side note as you wrote the book about Ty being this cook?
The thing that most fascinated me about that photo and about learning about the role of Ty Singh was my assumptions that I had coming into it. I had always assumed that the National Park Service, and frankly, all of our big national institutions that we love and hold dear, were creations of white men, probably mostly white men from the East Coast. And with the story of Ty Singh, I realized that the story is much, much more nuanced than that. That there have been many people from many places, many races, many ethnicities in our nation from the beginning of our nation. And they are part of the story of those institutions that we love. And of course, Ty Singh was in a position where he had very little institutional power. And yet he was someone who I think the evidence is very clear that he loved America very deeply. And he did what he could, given the position that he was in, to help create an institution that would protect the places that he loved. And I think that that's a really important thing for all of us, including kids, to know, is that our country is made up of the experiences of people from many, many different backgrounds, many different ethnicities, many different races. And it was actually, when I originally submitted this book to the publisher, the editor had been very encouraging, but she took it to the acquisitions committee, which is the group at the publisher that decides whether they publish it or not. And they initially turned it down. And they had many good edits for me that I incorporated. But one of the things that they were concerned about is they felt like I was giving Ty Singh too much credit for the creation of the National Park Service. And I did go back and change many things that they suggested, but I did think it was really important that we continue to give him some credit for the creation of the National Park Service, because I think too often people with power are the ones who get the credit for good things that happen when they could not accomplish everything they did without the help of many other people. And I think this is an example of Stephen Mather, who did wonderful things and has buildings named after him with good reason. But he could not have accomplished what he was trying to without these many people like Ty Singh, like the Wranglers, whose names we don't know, who were willing to help him try to advance his cause. And so this is pretty central to why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to praise the idea of immigration in the United States and also point out that our institutions are made by people from many, many different backgrounds.
And I won't spoil the ending of how Ty uses his own resources and special abilities to help convince those on the expedition to create the National Park Service. But I think it's very clever. Along that trip, there were many who traveled with that first group, and about 30, you say. Were there any others who intrigued you besides Ty Singh that you wish you could have written about a little bit more, but were limited to a children's book-length book?
Yeah, I was very interested in several of the campers who went along. One person who I came to really admire was Emerson Huff. He was a magazine writer. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. He would travel with the Wranglers and with Ty Singh instead of with the other group, and he was fascinated by what they were doing on the camping trip. He also, during the camping trip, there was one horse that died, or maybe it was a mule, I can't remember, but one animal died, and he was in tears over the death of the animal, and he just seemed like a very kind-hearted, good man. There was also a filmmaker, Burton Holmes, who was quite a character, and he really annoyed all the other campers because he kept making them stop and go back and walk along the same part that they already had so he could get a better angle for his film. And a few days into the camping trip, they told a ghost story, and it frightened him so much that he left the camping trip and didn't finish the camping trip. But he was an interesting person to research because he spent his life going to exotic places and making films about them. And this was in the very, very early days of the film industry, that he would have the little shorts before feature-length films about the places he'd been to. So he was a really fascinating person too. So yeah, it was fun to research the different campers who were on the trip.
For a children's book, you provide a lot of rich information, from the book jacket to the maps inside the cover to the dedications to the what you might be wondering section and the actual photographs. I don't think it would be fair, though, for us to pass over your illustrator, because I noticed that he has a dedication too. But his dedication reads like this, quote, "To my parents who kept the family together through tough times in a culture and country they knew very little about." And I had to wonder, did you choose him for that story that he carries, or his talent, or was it important to you to have both? So let's first talk about, what is his story? What's his family story?
Well, first of all, you have to know that in the children's publishing world, I do not pick the illustrator. The publishing house selects the illustrator, but they did choose him partly because of his background. Rich is from, I don't know, I think he was born in the United States, but his family is from Hong Kong, and he is actually a fine artist. This is only the second children's book that he has done. He generally is doing big canvases to show in museums. But the first book that he did was an autobiographical book about his family and about their move to the United States. It's called My Father's Chinese Opera. And so one of the things that made me so happy about this is I feel like he is kind of the equivalent of Tai Sing. Here was a boy who grew up in the United States speaking and writing Chinese, just like Tai Sing did. And in fact, if you notice on the back of the book, are some Chinese characters that are written by, in the context of the story, they were written by Tai Sing, but the characters themselves, they were done by Rich Lowe. They didn't have to outsource that job to anyone to decide what the Chinese words should say. And in some of the inside illustrations too, there's some Chinese writing. And so it's a wonderful thing, I think, that the illustrator is kind of a modern equivalent of the 19th century and early 20th century Tai Sing. But yeah, and he did do a great job with the illustrations. In fact, when I do school visits, one of the things I do is I show the historical photos that were some of my sources, and then I'll show the painting that Rich Lowe made. And he didn't paint the photos, but what he did is he took details from the historic photos, and you can find them in his illustrations. He did a marvelous job with them.
That would be fun to see. Can we find those on your website or on his website?
No, they are actually owned by Bancroft Library, and so I had to get permission to use them in school visits, but I do not have permission to publish them online, and so they're not on websites or anything. But you can look in the back of the book. Some of them we did get permission to look at. Let me see if I can see one of the examples in the back of the book. Oh, for example, in the book, there's a picture of all of the campers sitting around the table eating. And you can go to a page in the book that he used that photo as a reference. And it's a really fun, it's pages 28 and 29. But he made some significant changes in his illustration to match what's happening in the story. So anyway, it's a fun thing for kids and adults to do, to look at the historic photo and see what he decided to keep in and the things that he changed. And one thing that I hadn't noticed until school children showed me is in this photo, the historic photo, the people are sitting on a log, except the last two people are sitting on boxes. And Rich has that very precise detail in the illustration. Everyone except the last two people are sitting on a log, and they're sitting on boxes.
That's even more reason for our listeners to get your book, because you can't see it over a podcast. Well, before we go, I just have a few more questions. Because you're such a researcher, I wonder if there were any findings that you fell in love with that you just simply couldn't weave into the book that you wanted to.
Oh, that's a super good question. I was helped in that the book is about a 10-day trip. And so I was pretty constrained in what I was going to put in the book. Some of the information about some of the other campers I wanted to put in. For example, one of the campers was the first man to put dinosaur bones on display in a museum, which I thought was fascinating that he was one of the campers on this trip. But we ended up running out of space in the back of the book. And so we decided, well, that doesn't have that much to do with it. So we had to leave that out. But most of the things that I thought were really central about Tyson, we did put in. One thing that I had originally left out was I hadn't included anything about his assistant cook, Eugene. And in a very late edit in the book, my editor very wisely told me that she felt like this book was a way to bring Tyson to the front of people's attention because he'd always been shoved to the back. And she said, I feel like we're doing the same thing to Eugene, that we're just ignoring him, like we don't talk about him except in the back matter. And she said, is there any way we can put him into the book? And at first I was really doubtful that there was, because there just isn't very much written about him. But I went back and I looked at all the places that people had written about Eugene. And I realized that there actually were some ways that I could include him. And so I'm so grateful that I had a really sensitive editor who saw ways that we could include more things about the trip in the text.
And you include some information for our listeners' sake. You do include a paragraph about him in the information at the back. So if they want to know more about him that way, they could always reference him there. What do you hope most that children will take away from your story?
I have two hopes. One hope is I hope that kids will see Tyson as a model for what to do when things go wrong, because he had big things go wrong on this trip and he had very few resources out in the wilderness to change things, but he managed to not only make things work, but to make things really wonderful. And I think that that's true in kids' lives too. They're undoubtedly going to face setbacks, but that doesn't mean that they have to give up on what they're trying to do. They just need to find a different way to get around the problem. So that's one thing. And then my other big hope is that this book will be part, and there are many books written around this theme lately, thank goodness, but I hope that it will be part of that dialogue, reminding us about all the many people who have contributed to making our country what it is. That it's not that, the famous people are important. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are very important people in our country's history. But there are many, many other people who maybe aren't as well known, who, women, people who come from different races, people of different ethnicities, who all contributed to making our country what it is.
You are a nonfiction children's author, and you say that you believe this is a golden age for kids' nonfiction. So I'm really intrigued by that, and I'm wondering what evidence we have that supports that claim.
Oh, there are some wonderful nonfiction books being published. In, I believe it was the year 2000, the American Library Association started a new children's book award, and it's called the Siebert Informational Medal, and it's for the best nonfiction books. And so they give an award to a nonfiction picture book, and they also get an award to either a middle grade or young adult nonfiction book. And I think that that's been a huge impetus to publishers looking at what's getting published, and publishers are devoting huge resources to children's nonfiction now. You can look at the Newbery and the Caldecott Awards for like their first, 100 years of existence, and there are almost no nonfiction books in it. But if you look at it in the last 15 to 20 years, there are many nonfiction books that are getting the medals and the awards. And that's true across all of the book awards. There's also a much greater willingness these days for publishers to provide a lot of extensive back matter, like the back matter in my book, that includes extra information. These days, they will include bibliographies, which 20 years ago, picture books, for example, didn't ever include bibliographies. But now it's very standard to include bibliographies and source quotations. And there's also been a move with Common Core, whether you love Common Core or hate Common Core, it does mean that schools are using a lot more nonfiction in their schools, and so publishers are trying to provide it. So there are just some really, really wonderful nonfiction books being published these days, and some of them have really original research. Steve Shankin published Port Chicago 50, I think 2 years ago, and he did all sorts of original research, went and interviewed people who were involved in this historical event, people who had never been interviewed. And so you see a lot of really great research being done too for kids.
Well, the future looks bright. And I'm thrilled that you'll be contributing to the genre. You have another book coming out called Girl Running, Bobby Gibb and the Boston Marathon, and we'll look forward to that being published in 2018. We thank you for being on our program today. We loved hearing about your book, and we wish you well.
Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to an interview with Annette Pimentel, author of the children's nonfiction book, Mountain Chef, How One Man Lost His Groceries, Changed His Plans, and Helped Cook Up the National Park Service. You'll find a link to her book on our website, nonfictionforlife.com. You'll also find a link to Richard Lowe's book, Father's Chinese Opera, that Pimentel mentioned in the interview. While you're there on the website, if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for our email list. Just click on the Connect button, and we'll let you know when we publish our latest blog posts and podcasts. And we want to hear from you, so please take a minute to leave a review of the podcast. As always, you can like our Facebook page and follow us on Instagram and Twitter. We really hope we're helping you save time as we curate books that are insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this has been another episode of the Nonfiction for Life podcast. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.